For example, Hadiths. They narrate a hadith to Omar. Is there anyone else who heard this with you? He asks. And he says this angrily, you must bring me another person who heard it with you. This is how it is. I'm not saying the content is worthless. In fact, when I look at Islamic sciences as a whole, we do consider the content. But I'm saying content without attribution can lead to incorrect conclusions. You might find a beautiful saying by a great philosopher. This could be attributed to the Prophet. Are we going to attribute it to the Prophet? That's not the case at all. Attribution is very important to us. The Prophet, how well do you know the Prophet? For example, how good of an Islamic historian are you? How good of a scholar of the Prophet's biography are you? The Prophet, how do you know how the Prophet lived so that you can judge whether he did or did not say a particular hadith? Isnad constitutes a significant part of a hadith scholar's work. That's why, even in the modern era, it remains the most debated aspect of hadith. Let me start by saying this first. Is this incident worth the effort for us to attribute? Is this a genuine narration? Is it possible it came from the Prophet? Because it provides the answer to these questions. We first look at the isnad. When we talk about isnad, what we mean is this. When you open a hadith, there is a chain of narrators. In other words, a sequence of names. We call them ravi. In other words, the people who transmit the hadith. And then there is the text. The text is the hadith itself, the words or actions of the Prophet. Now, this chain of narrators, isnad, is not just about listing names. These narrators must be connected to each other. That is, they must have had the possibility of meeting each other, lived in the same place or lived in the same time period. The narrators are in succession. You can think of it like this. So after the Prophet, who should come next? The companions. Yes, there are companions in the isnad. After the companions, who should come next? Those who reached them. In other words, the tabi'un. This continues like this until it enters the sources. In fact, even after it enters the sources, it continues to be transmitted with isnad. Also regarding isnad, we sometimes encounter debates about whether isnad exists in other nations or not. Orientalists also bring this issue to the agenda. That is, when we talk about isnad, it's not just a list of narrators. There are also phrases among the narrators. These phrases as well. I mean, if we translate them into Turkish, phrases like I heard, I listened, he transmitted to us, he read to us, he wrote to us. Based on these, for one thing, we can understand whether the teacher and the student were present in the same setting. And also, in my opinion, the most important thing, we mentioned this in the first program, if you remember, from the biographies. Our isnad system is a system that needs to be evaluated together with this biographical literature. So we are not just listing names. We also check the biographies of these names. That's why. It really is a holistic system. This is also the reason why so much importance is given to isnad in hadith. So when you see any random word, you can take it from the Prophet Muhammad. Said this. Or that the Prophet Muhammad said something like this. You can't be satisfied with just the statement. There is a historical distance between us and the Prophet Muhammad. During this historical distance, through what stages did this hadith pass and who are the people in between? The answer to this question is the isnad. That's why it is so valuable. In fact, it also seems similar to the care we take in academic texts when citing sources to avoid plagiarism. In other words, we can think of it as a kind of proper footnoting method. The source of the information, where did I get this information from? For example, sometimes things like this happen. You don't see the original work yourself. You transmit it from someone who has seen the work. In that case, you indicate this in the footnote, transfer from this. As you mentioned earlier, to avoid falling into plagiarism. Isnad, when it comes to hadith, I sometimes say, think of it like a genealogy. In other words, through whose hands has this hadith passed before it reached us? How did it come down? Who transmitted it? That's why it's valuable. Isnad is the analysis of hadith. Isnad actually provides us with an opportunity. Yes. Why should we give up on this opportunity? From this perspective, it is very valuable.
Now, regarding this, there are also some situations that are seen in society and sometimes criticized. I mean, we can encounter reactions like this. For example, I can't even remember what happened yesterday. How can people remember and transmit so much information? Or for instance, did nothing ever change or get altered during transmission? Of course, you are explaining its reliability, methodology and procedure here, but still such doubts can remain. Is there anything you can point to as a clear indicator regarding this?
Well, let me put it this way. If we were to rely solely on the narration of a single transmitter, such doubts could be raised more often. Or I can understand that. But we never rely on just one transmitter's narration. In other words, is there a second person who transmitted this hadith from that companion? Or not just from the companion? Is there a second companion who heard this hadith directly from the Prophet himself? This is always our practice. So we don't settle for just a specific chain of transmission in a particular book. That's why the first thing we do is collect all the versions of that hadith, as they appear in all the books. And then we compare them with each other. We draw a tree, we create a chain of transmission diagram. And so to speak, for example, imagine a teacher as the person at the top of the branch. And from him, it splits into various branches. We don't settle for just one branch. We always compare all of them with each other and trace this process backward from the end to the beginning. Today, we do this through works. So when we look at the scholars of the past, they also did not settle for just one person. Of course, for example, when someone says, I heard this from so-and-so, is there anyone else besides you who heard this? From among the companions? Let alone the generation of the followers, for example. Even in the generation of the companions, which is such a valuable generation, we see this. For example, to Hadiths. Omar, a hadith is narrated. Is there anyone else who heard this along with you? He asks. And he says this with anger. You must absolutely bring me another person who heard this with you. This is how it is. Let me also say this. Now, there are experts in every field. For example, sometimes when I explain an issue related to hadith, or when I'm speaking somewhere and my mother listens to me, she says, how do you remember so many things? For her, that much information, it's a lot for her. However, when my knowledge is compared to others, it's actually very little. But for her, it seems like a lot. So why do I know this information better than him? Why can I keep it in my mind better? Because I grew up with this. I mean, elementary school, middle school, high school, university, master's degree, PhD, and then teaching, explaining the same topics to maybe several classes a day. So people's aptitudes and abilities, these are different things. Their purposes differ. For example, not all companions narrated hadiths equally. He does not narrate hadith. So don't think of it like this. All the companions narrated thousands of hadiths. No. A significant portion of the hadith literature we have comes from 7 companions. And when I look at them, I see that they had close relationships with the Prophet. For example, one of them is Lady Aisha. His wife is also the daughter of Hazrat Abu Bakr. So she is very important. And then at a later stage, there is a Tabi'i narrator named Urwa. She is his aunt, and we receive a lot of narrations from Urwa. Do you see the connections? Or for example, I am the older sister. What wouldn't they do? He is the Prophet's cousin, but at the same time, his aunt is the Prophet's wife. He goes in and out of the Prophet's house. So what I mean is there are these kinds of close relationships. Just as not everyone today is well versed in the science of hadith, not everyone in the history of hadith was a hadith scholar either. That's why narrators are not just ordinary people about whom we could say, I can't even remember what I ate yesterday. Those people are having fun anyway, because the flaws in their memory affect their narrations. And for that reason, their narrations are either not accepted or are immediately classified as weak.
That requires a different perspective. So, Professor, now we're talking about the chain of transmission. We've always been looking at the method and procedure in terms of how the transmission is done. But there's also the content of these hadiths. It seems as if when talking about this chain and method, the content part becomes less important. Which one is more important? I mean, if we focus entirely on the transmission part, could we see a picture of not being valued here?
Now, generally, in the modern era, this is one of the main criticisms directed at hadith or hadith scholars. In other words, that we place too much value on the isnad and neglect the text. But let me say this. We need to divide the text into 2 parts. First, the text in terms of its form, that is, its wording. For example, imagine a text consisting of 6 sentences. So have all 6 sentences of that hadith come from all of its transmitters? Did the 6 sentences come with synonymous words or with the exact same words? This is about the form. It's independent of the content. Hadith scholars have paid a lot of attention to this. In other words, they have been very concerned with the wording part of the text. Our main issue is to compare these texts from this perspective. But the issue of content that you mentioned, for example, you transmit this hadith and it's authentic, but still, is it compatible with the Quran? Is it compatible with the Sunnah? These kinds of questions. Hadith scholars usually evaluate these questions in terms of compatibility with the Sunnah. We have to give them their due credit. That is, the Sunnah of our Prophet. The Sunnah is not primarily information passed by attribution, but knowledge learned by observing, passed down generations. This is called practiced by continuous transmission, amile mutawatir. Let me give an example. For instance, how did you learn to perform prayer, namaz? You didn't learn it from books, most likely. You didn't learn it from hadiths either. You stood next to your mother and learned by repeating her movements. The companions learned from the Prophet in the same way, and it was transmitted like this.
There is an example here.
This is the Sunnah. Hadith scholars connect this transmitted material to the Sunnah. Circumcision, we call it the famous Sunnah. Widespread, well known. In other words, we are very sure that the Prophet did it this way. They always compare it with the Sunnah. Also, Hadith scholars are excellent historians. For example, if a companion is mentioned in a Hadith and it says he participated in a battle, the Hadith scholar also evaluates the content of the Hadith and asks, was this companion alive at that time or not? Accordingly. But apart from this, what you probably mean by content is the compatibility of Hadiths with the Quran, with reason, and perhaps with experience. This is not something Hadith scholars do, but rather, in our Islamic scholarly tradition, it is the jurists and the theologians who have done this. Let me say that. That's why, for example, sometimes they may not act upon a hadith that we consider authentic. There are such differences. However, in the modern era, there is something like this. At least, to be honest, I don't look at the issue that way. But there are people who do see it that way. That is, without considering the chain of transmission at all, just based on the content. The Prophet may have said this. This is not possible, or my Prophet says this, he cannot say it. In other words, some say, if it fits his life, that's enough for us. But we question that too. It's not a very sound method. Because, for example, how well do you know the Prophet? For instance, how good of an Islamic historian are you? How good of a scholar of the Prophet's biography are you? The Prophet, how do you know how the Prophet lived so that you can judge whether he said this hadith or not? Let's give an example like this. Our Prophet was very compassionate. We know this for certain. Their wives are telling. His children tell us, the companions tell us. We look at his hadiths. He had no mother or father. He showed respect to his mother's friends and his father's friends. In other words, compassion, gratitude and appreciation were fundamental traits of his life. But at the same time, such a person was also able to fight. From this perspective, you might say that the Prophet never took prisoners or never fought. But under the conditions of that time, not taking prisoners, it would be like, if you'll allow the expression, starting a match 10-0 behind. Because here's the thing. You would be going to war and your opponent would take prisoners, but you wouldn't. Or, for example, take what was done to the Banu Qurayza Jews. You might say, my Prophet would never do such a thing. But the reports are right in front of us. Do you see what I mean? In other words, how accurate is our perception of the Prophet and how well do we really know the conditions of that era? So, based on the content, when is it possible to make such a claim? If we had been companions, if we had some direct experience with the Prophet, we see this in the case of Hazrat Aisha.
Maybe there's also this, Professor. Perhaps it will be clearer when we consider that he is a human being as well as a prophet. The picture, because, as you said, by filtering out behaviors they don't deem appropriate for a prophet and not taking into account his humanity, they attribute only good and positive qualities to him. Of course, he has good and positive qualities, but there are also other aspects that come from being human and from the social conditions he lived in.
That's why, just based on the content, I'm not saying the content is worthless. In fact, when I look at Islamic sciences as a whole, we do take the content into account. But I'm saying that content without attribution can lead us to incorrect conclusions. You might come across a very beautiful saying by a great philosopher. But are we going to attribute this to the Prophet Muhammad? There's no such thing. Attribution is very important for us.
And there's also the concept of a common narrator. Professor, what does that mean? I mean, how is attribution related to textual analysis? A common narrator like that?
I mentioned comparisons. We make these comparisons based on common narrators. Let's put it this way. When a hadith is transmitted, there are certain narrators who are focused on. So, for example, what could this be caused by? It could be because that narrator is more involved in transmitting hadiths than others. Or it could be because they are a very prominent figure in hadith transmission. It could be due to having a large number of students. Or in terms of hadith transmission, for example, if you are in a peripheral region, you wouldn't have many students. Think about it today, for example, if he doesn't prefer Ankara over Istanbul of students. So being in Mecca, Medina, Basra or Kufa could affect the number of students you have. It can change and influence your student count. There are such narrators in the history of hadith as well. And we call these people common narrators. This is how it relates to isnad and text analysis. We compare the texts that come from common narrators with each other. For example, let's think of it this way. Zuhri is a common narrator. It's very important, of course. By comparing the texts transmitted by Zuhri students with each other, we determine whether the text really comes from Zuhri. That is, we identify it based on the overlap between them. That's why isnad and text analysis cannot be done without common narrators. It simply can't be done.
It has a very significant importance. So, Professor, you are talking about the traditional method. From what I understand, current studies actually use the traditional method with modern techniques. That's how I see it. How can we use technology here, or to what extent are we using it? Could you also explain a bit about the role of technology in the science of hadith?
We can put it this way. In the last 10 years, we've started to use technology much more through various software programs. There are programs mostly developed in the Arab world, but various programs are also being developed in Turkey. There are also online databases. These need to be further improved. One of our most important tasks is to collect all the sources where the hadith appears. At this point, software programs are now very helpful to us. So we can say that we no longer have a gap in that area. There are just some works that exist only in manuscript form. These need to be critically edited and then transferred into these computer programs. This can be accomplished over time. But the existing works are sufficient for us. Let me just say that in the second stage, we have the issue of accessing all the narrations of a particular narrator collectively. We can access these for now, but we will compare them automatically. We do not yet have such a program at our disposal. We have a lot of difficulty drawing isnad diagrams. Some programs help us draw isnad diagrams, but the diagrams are neither visually appealing nor the hadith. Those diagrams may not sufficiently guide us in extracting the independent transmission history of that hadith. They appear clustered. You have difficulty seeing relationships. But these issues can be resolved. Also, last year there was an isnad meta-analysis symposium. Mostly participants from abroad, Orientalists, attended, those who make metabolism. For example, there was a presentation there about artificial intelligence and isnad meta-analysis. For example, such a study is being conducted in the West. In the long run, maybe. For instance, I completed my thesis on isnad methodologies in 2010. I defended it in 2011. It takes a lot of time. Really identifying that narrator, drawing the isnad diagram. One hadith, one thesis. It makes up a part of a thesis. But if these databases are prepared and used in a highly functional way, the process will progress much faster. And perhaps the doubts in people's minds about hadith will be more. Because people, inevitably, they expect clear, concrete, positive answers. They want answers they can grasp. I explained the hadith transmission system and how reliable it is, but people also want to see the outcome. It will be possible to conduct isnad and content analysis on many hadiths. Sometimes debates arise over the wording, like why is this wording used in this hadith? Or why did the Prophet say this? Did he really say it? Whether those exact words appear in all the narrations, these kinds of issues, these debates, which usually take a very long time, might be resolved in a much shorter period. I think it will be beneficial in this way.
Let's hope it turns out that way. Professor, after all, we live in an era where technology is advancing rapidly and has become a part of every aspect of our lives. With the acceleration of these developments, we can also foresee that our work in this field will progress much faster. Let this also be a message to our friends who are software developers. Let's call out to them. Let's hope they work in this field. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Dear viewers, we talked about the textual analysis of isnad in hadiths. Today, see you in the next episode. Goodbye.